Welcome to our 5th annual Spring Symposium. Thank you all for joining us. We hope you all enjoy your time here in Cyprus. Thank you.
I think Ibo's an amazingly modest man. This is the 5th time that he's hosted this symposium here with his great generosity and hospitality. And I think we should all give him a round of applause before we start for this meeting. Thank you, Ibo. And today, on day 1 of the symposium, we've got two particular areas. One is ethics in reproductive medicine, and then the second area is optimizing IVF success. There's a slight change to the programme in that Charles Kingsland isn't with us, so I'm going to stand in with a slightly different talk, not commercialism and IVF. But to begin with, we're going to hand over to Peter here for the first session to take over chair, and I hope you enjoy the programme.
Okay, thank you, Tony, and I'd just like to add my thanks, and maybe on behalf of everybody else, thanks to Ibo and his team and Claire for inviting us all out to this wonderful location once again. We've had a very good programme over the 2 days. I'd also like to thank Tony for putting the programme together. So without further ado, we'll get our first speaker up. It's Dr. Chris Bulmer, who's a senior counsellor at Leeds, and he's going to talk to us about posthumous use. Just because we can, should we? Yes.
Welcome everybody, and a huge thanks to the organisers of the conference. I feel very privileged and very honoured to be invited to this 5th meeting. It's become a very significant event on the annual CPD calendar for all of us, and so I'm sure that we're looking forward to an interesting and challenging programme. There is just one thing I would like to say before I start, and we have a very, very special VIP guest with the meeting, and she sat at the back, and she's the reason why we all do what we do. She's the reason why this partnership is proving to be such a good success. And I am, of course, referring to Jessica. So can we please have a round of applause for Jessica? For those of you who've not had a chance to meet Jessica, she's sat at the back. She's the one that looks about 9 months old, so she's pretty easy to spot. Okay, so posthumous treatment. So what I want to do in this session is to bring some of the experience that we have out of our counselling rooms at LCRM. Some of that work is based on research, some of it's observations that we've made over a number of weeks of the practice that we introduced. So it's a glimpse into the work that we do with patients. I want to raise this question about, should we offer treatment just because we can? And I'd look at some implications for clinical practice. Counsellors in infertility will inevitably be dealing with welfare of the child issues on a weekly basis, and I think we often will say in our clinical supervision sessions, look, just because we can, should we, which is where this title came from. So in terms of fertility preservation, so this is based on our clinic experience, if you just bear that in mind. So we generally find, since we introduced mandatory implications counselling for posthumous use, principally use of sperm, we find 2 kinds of patients. There are they're just in case. Why not? The nurse has asked me if I want to tick this box. Why not? Just in case. And the others are the patients who are undergoing cancer treatment. For them, it's a very different experience, and I'll just highlight some of that. Interestingly, though, when you look around at some of the popular press, and indeed this is reflected on the HFEA website, is the number of service personnel who are now routinely freezing sperm before being deployed in a theatre of war. This is becoming quite common practice, Here from the Sun newspaper, dozens of soldiers off to the front line in Afghanistan have been freezing their sperm. From The Guardian, just this January, partners freeze sperm of troops on active duty. And then this interesting piece from the New York Times only last month announced a program supported by the Pentagon where they are going to pay for fertility preservation for their frontline soldiers in a pilot project. And this is an increasing trend. Interesting, I had a quick look on the internet before coming today. I found 2 clinics in London that were both offering pretty substantial discounts for service personnel who want to freeze sperm prior to deployment. So that's clearly going to be an increasing issue. So, as I said, my patients, 2 types, the just in case, keep this in mind, the just in case, those undergoing treatment. I would say, how many counsellors have we got here today? Could you just put your hand up if you're in counselling in psychology? 1. No, 2 then in that case. Okay, so I hope you'll agree with this, but much of implications counselling is quite formulaic. It's pretty straightforward. In most cases, it focuses on the implications, those feelings about those implications, and what that means for them and their potential children. Occasionally, you'll come across some more serious psychopathology, but by and large, you don't. It's very straightforward. What I will say is that the work that we did through our psychology services working with posthumous use patients was that we very much felt that this was slightly off-piste. There was a number of things occurring that were quite surprising and quite difficult and quite challenging for us. There were moments when we thought, are we doing more harm than good providing this counselling, which was quite interesting. So I'll just try and talk us through some of those things. So, over several weeks, I looked at 21 patients and asked them, made sure that I asked them questions, wrote down verbatim their responses. Okay, what do you think it might be like for a child born in this way? Straightforward question, casually asked. Of the 21 patients, I was quite surprised that only 2 had superficially thought about it. And when I say superficially, I mean really superficially, only 2. So 19 had said that they'd given no thought at all to it, or they had clearly given no thought at all to it. And interestingly, when we did sit down, there were a further 4 patients, not all of mine, but between us, who then, after implications counselling for posthumous use, had decided not to go ahead with it. And in fact, I think on 2 of those occasions have withdrawn consent, and the other 2 didn't consent. So this certainly would add weight to the argument that implications counselling for posthumous use is of value. The sorts of things that these patients were saying, now I wrote these down as verbatim during the session. Want to keep positive. These were the patients in cancer treatment. Want to keep positive. Don't want to look at the bad side. Just want to look ahead. Don't want to think about that. We've put all our trust in this treatment, the cancer treatment, the chemotherapy, radiotherapy, not infertility treatment. Want to fight. Concentrate on getting well. So somewhere in that, with that mindset, you're trying to help patients to think about the implications of a child born after their death. So you can see it's not an easy task. People simply do not want to do that. So in the case examples that I observed, there were quite a lot of avoidant behaviours, classical avoidant behaviours, poor eye contact, changing the focus of the discussion, the women particularly being protective, repetitively interjecting, trying to draw my conversation away from the men to protect the men so they don't have to think about it, don't have to talk about it. And also non-complimentary body language. In other words, people clearly being uncomfortable, looking away, not sitting, not engaged with the conversation, all of which, of course, indicative of increased levels of stress and anxiety. So men also, interestingly, of these observed cases, and I know it's only a handful, I know it is, and we would hope to do more work, just want to support her. These are the men negating responsibility, just want to support her for her own peace of mind. Obviously it's up to her, it's not really my decision, I might not be here, so I can't really do anything. So quite a lot of avoidance and disconnectedness, which was much more observable in the men than in the women, who were much more likely in my clinics to want to engage with this discussion. So what about some more general observations then, or considerations? Successful posthumous treatment will mean a child will stand as a constant reminder of what is lost. There may be a great deal of ambivalence using the sperm. The thing I would say about grief is that it is an elongated social process. It has a beginning generally, a middle generally, and an end generally. That's how it works. So when somebody makes a decision, like a temporal slice of time, they make a decision to do something. How relevant is that decision in 6 months, a year, 2 years, 5 years' time? This decision was made an awfully long time ago, and we recognise that for some patients, what they decide today may not bear much relationship to what they think they might want to do in the future, and that in itself may raise issues for them. The surviving partner might feel a sense of guilt or betrayal if she chooses not to proceed with treatment. And of course, allowing the sperm to perish is just about the grief starting all over again, perhaps, or just elongating it. So, in terms of thinking through, it's very difficult to think through, to conceptualise how we want to think about posthumous use. I gave this some thought and felt that really attachment and grief were two relevant psychological theories in terms of trying to understand the human experience of this approach to this unconventional approach to family. Now, we understand that grief and loss is a deeply psychological process. It is quite social as well, but it is deeply psychological. We know that there are lots of symptoms that are very predictable and that there is a trajectory towards people travel, which is usually some process of recovery. Kubler-Ross's grief model moves through denial, anger and depression through to bargaining and acceptance. It's a very typical approach to grief. There are some more contemporary models which I think also have merit, particularly the excellent Bowlby's work perhaps is a little older, but certainly William Warden, for those counsellors here will know about William Warden's work, Bill Warden's work on grief. But essentially these are all trajectories. So, you know, if you're going to make a decision about something really important, where do you make that decision? Where you can be confident that it's been made with all the right cognition in place in order to think that through carefully. So we think about grief. To be honest, I hardly see any women who are going ahead with posthumous use. I've seen a few, but I've not seen very many in the many years that I've been working in Leeds Centre for Reproductive Medicine. I wonder if somebody would be kind enough just to turn the microphone down a tad, if possible, just to stop the feedback. That would be really helpful if anybody understands how that works. Just to stop it echoing. So, in terms of grief to acceptance, some of the empirical work looking at bereavement suggests that normal grief, which is different to more complicated pathological grief that occurs for different reasons, such as not having a body or through a tragic road accident or something which is manifestly different. But grief we can see here, if I just move this on actually, we can see that it's peaking at between 3 and 4 months, not right away, which actually you might think is the case. It isn't the case. It tends to peak at 3 to 4 months. And what we see is a reduction in symptoms associated with grief and loss at anywhere between about 17 to 24 months. Why is that important? Well, it's important if we have to think with our patients about when the time is right to consider treatment. On the basis of this, I would suggest that in fact, much before that, needs to be very carefully managed. In other words, the trajectory of grief needs to occur in order for us to have some confidence that a patient's cognitive processes are requisite to making such important decisions. So we say that grief is typically uncomplicated grief, typically up to 24 months. So can we trust decision making? Well, having looked again at the psychological research, it's very difficult to conclude anything for sure. There is some evidence that suggests that there is quite a lot of avoidance of decision making during grief. On the other hand, there's other evidence to suggest that improved ability to select from a range of options. So I suppose what I'm saying is that it is actually quite difficult to say for sure that people's ability to make such important decisions are truly impaired during grief. And we need to bear that in mind. But I think it's a note of caution. I think if we believe that somebody is actively grieving for the loss of their partner, I think it's questionable as to whether we should be navigating them through to using treatment in terms of posthumous use of sperm in particular. Some authors have suggested a period of not less than 12 months, but this is a great opinion piece, but it's not based on any particular research. I think the best work that I've seen is Bill Warden's work, who argues that around 50% will have completed grief within 1 year. And this is somebody who is close, not a distant relative, for whom we may feel sad but not grieve. Attachment theory is interesting insofar as, I hope you can see the bottom of the slide there, because it is important. Mum has had a relationship with the dad. The child has had no relationship, has made no choices, has not consented to treatment, and so it's the grown-ups that are making all the decisions. There is no reason to believe that this child will have any sense of attachment to who this person is. But there's every reason to believe that the mum would expect that, because after all, she's loved this person. This is what the consent is about, is to have this child, possibly have this child afterwards. We know that most of the early attachment taking place between 5 or maybe 7 years, depending on what you read, is important. But actually, the social attachment and the more psychologically emotional attachments take place into adolescence. This is not going to happen. This child has no relationship with its dad, only that which is created or understood or discussed by mum. And she needs to understand that this is not the same kind of relationship. Whatever relationship she imagines that her child might have with this invisible father, it's not going to be based on normal attachment, which is what we would hope our relationships are in fact based on. So neither of these attachments develop. There is nobody there to develop an attachment with. So, what are some other considerations? What are the expectations of the parent about the nature of the child's relationship? I've just mentioned that. You know, is it realistic? Once a child is old enough to experience loss, will this be evident? As I've said, unborn children can't consent. How would they feel about that? And the child's experience of loss will change as that child develops over the years. As they enter phases of their social development, social and psychological development, their need for a parent to provide a function changes as the years go on. And of course, what expectations would a child have of this father figure who has never been there at all? So, what do we advise the grown-ups to consider? Well, we advise them to consider that talking and telling for the future and implications, particularly into early years education, is crucial. You can just picture this in the early years classroom. So a child is in reception or year 1, and all the kids around the table and the teachers getting them to draw pictures of families and where they live and a family tree. Okay, so that's different then, isn't it? And there'll be lots of encounters like that that simply won't add up. They'll be unusual and difficult to explain. Not a reason to avoid doing posthumous treatment. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying from the child's point of view, it will continue to encounter these challenging moments in time where it will feel ill-equipped because it's outside of the range of everybody else's social experience around them, unless the class happens to have other children in a similar position, which is probably fairly unlikely. What are the wider family expectations? And also, how might they feel about letting the sperm go at some stage? And of course, the other crucial thing is the thing in all of the models of grief, one of the key milestones that indicates that someone is towards the end or completed their cycle of grief is reinvesting their emotions and their affections in new people. And then that's very different, isn't it? That's very different. The consenting to the freezing of the sperm for the possible posthumous treatment later, how relevant is that at that point in time when everybody else has moved on several months or even several years? What we also advise the grown-ups to consider is to create enduring loving memories. And so we talk about things like an All About Daddy book, Daddy's treasure box, letters, video message. Can you imagine trying to have these conversations with somebody who's in the middle of treatment for cancer? Can you imagine trying to do that when the last thing that they want to be thinking about is this? But when we know, for those of us that work in counselling psychology, we know that it is important. And this is why I say that implications counselling for posthumous use felt a bit off-piece, because you're kind of backing people into a corner, trying to get them to think and talk about things they simply don't want to. But these are important. These sorts of techniques are not out of the air. They're based on evidence that they do have a positive impact. Adolescent adjustment, identity, the absence of the person, and relationships with future attachment figures will also all be important and interesting journeys for a young person to navigate. There is evidence that shows that irrespective of the reasons for parental loss, as well as material circumstances in which the children lived, those who possessed adequate and favourable information about the absent parent fared better on emotional well-being scales. And so this is one of the reasons, and there's a few interesting studies in this area, we don't have time to explore them here, but they're important to us, to counsellors, because it helps to guide our practice. It helps us to think about how do we prepare couples that are wanting to consent, wanting to tick that box and sign on the line for possible posthumous treatment. This is why we talk about things like a memory box, or Daddy's treasure chest, or an All About Me book about Daddy. This is why we try to create these enduring, loving memories so that a child has at least got something on which to base some kind of relationship, be it virtual. Okay, so just because we can, should we? Well, there is a significant lack of longitudinal observational research. It's just simply not available. You'll know from discussions that we've had previously at these meetings that particularly people like Professor Susan Gollenbach, you will have heard of and probably read some of her papers. She's involved in longitudinal observational research, children through, I think one of her studies is looking at the kids. I think they're now 7 years old. 7 years old, I think, last year. So, but there's nothing longitudinally that's watching the mums and that's watching the children. Okay. We know that psychological outcomes for children are generally good with art. We know it differs between different techniques. There are differences. And the conditions of talking and telling, whether a child knows, finds out, we know all of that has an impact. You'll have heard that discussed here before at this meeting, because in our work it's a very crucial issue. So just because we can, should we? Well, are we at risk of elongating or complicating grief? Particularly if it's unsuccessful. Particularly at risk with people with low mood. This is very controversial. This research is comprehensive and controversial. The poorer social, behavioural, mental health outcomes, increased drug and alcohol use in single-parent households. Can I just say that there are plenty of examples of single parenting which are, compared to anything, are a huge success. But the evidence overall is pretty clear that social outcomes are poorer in single-parent households, and not just for reasons of income. But it was influenced by income. So, in the absence of any evidence to the contrary, there is no demonstrable basis to deny treatment. But it ethically, because this section, if you remember, the introduction is to think ethically about this. Well, so there's no evidence not to do something, so that means we can do it, presumably. Well, I mean, if there's no evidence not to do something, why should we not do it? I'm not saying that we shouldn't, but we should think carefully about that. And maybe the issue is more about timing, more than anything else. There is an argument in the literature. It is not research, it's opinion pieces, but they're very interesting. But there are several arguments that the emotional experience of loss is probably within normal range, and so it's not necessarily something we should be overly concerned about. We know from the evidence that it's mothers who lead the talking and telling. It's not the dads, it's the mothers. So maybe that's another reason to support this. There is clearly a much reduced opportunity for secrecy. And of course, since 2003, the father's name is on the birth certificate as well, which also could well make a difference to children in terms of their identity to their parent. So, practice considerations and summary. Well, given that most patients haven't really considered the implications of posthumous treatment, I was truly shocked by how little couples have thought about this. Truly, truly shocked by that. Posthumous use implications counselling, I think, is hugely advisable. Of the clinics, the different clinics here, LCRM in Leeds, so it's mandatory for us, notwithstanding the strengthening of consent, reasons around that. Are there other clinics where it's now mandatory for patients to consent to posthumous use? Are you seeing them as a mandatory part of your counselling clinics? Is it only LCRM where it's mandatory? No other clinics it's mandatory. That's interesting. So that gives us some food for thought. Based on these reflections from our own clinics, I would argue that whether you want to call it mandatory or not, guiding patients into this has proved to be a very worthwhile exercise. Hugely time consuming, but a very worthwhile exercise. Okay. So in terms of implications for practice, I think that timing is absolutely crucial. The point at which a patient might present wanting to consider treatment using their deceased partner's sperm, the timing is crucial. I think we have a real ethical responsibility to satisfy ourselves that there are no concerns that might suggest that there are clinical reasons in terms of mood or a mood disorder that we think might undermine their ability to consent to that treatment going ahead. I think we have to be so careful, and I think this is absolutely a role for counsellors in infertility. So, of the clinics who are represented here, if a lady wanted to progress using her dead husband's sperm, would it be mandatory at that point for them to see an infertility counsellor? Can you put your hands up if that's mandatory? Right, okay. Could you please be kind enough to put your hands up if it's not mandatory? Okay, interesting. The balance has definitely swung towards the mandatory at that point. I think that's right. I think that's based on good practice. I applaud that. Okay. So sensitive psychosocial assessment should take place at the point, certainly at that point. It's absolutely crucial at that point, because the implications of progressing to treatment when somebody is really not fit to make a decision are huge, ethically huge. So timing is very important. If there are concerns, then it might be that that assessment needs to be more robust. We may choose to use instruments like the Beck Depression Inventory, the Core 10 if we're significantly concerned about risk, but I hope we're not using a Core 10 assessment with our patients, because we would be concerned about their safety if we were using a Core 10 assessment. We might want to use a Beck Hopelessness Scale. A social functioning questionnaire is an excellent judge of just how well somebody's socially functioning in their everyday life. And of course, if there are more significant concerns, then we might look at ICD-10 and DSM-5. These are the diagnostic criteria for mental illness. We would hope we're not looking at that, but prolonged grief is in both ICD-10 and DSM-5. So we have to be very careful to understand that prolonged grief, abnormal grief, is recognised as a psychiatric condition. It's something which all the counsellors here would recognise when meeting a patient on 2 or 3 occasions. So, just in conclusion, then, the welfare of the child is, of course, the most important issue to consider. Having a child in this way becomes a lifelong commitment to supporting that child's appropriate psychological adjustment to the what I refer to as the ever-present, ever-absent parent. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. So maybe time for 1 or 2 quick questions.
What then, on the basis of the work you've presented, is the implications for women who choose single motherhood using donor sperm, where they haven't got any information and the child doesn't have access to what would be the useful information until it's 18?
The implicate. Well, there's 2 things. There's 2 things, you know. Certainly, there's the issue about talking and telling. Talking and telling. It's referred to as talking and telling is helping a child to learn about their biological beginnings. The talking and telling will, I think, is an important mediator in both of those circumstances, whatever the circumstances of the absent parent, or whether it's a single parenting. So that's certainly the imperative to inform a young person through interactive play, not conversation, but through interactive play is important, and I think that will help to mediate their experience. The second point, I guess, is that we know from the evidence that social outcomes in single-parent households are poorer compared to the presence of 2 parents. Not necessarily of the same sex, I hasten to add, not necessarily heterosexual parents. And so that also raises concerns. But I think in neither case do we find any compelling evidence, and certainly not for posthumous use, do I think we'll find any compelling evidence to suggest that we shouldn't be doing this. But I am concerned that we haven't got compelling evidence to suggest that we should.
I've got a bit of a practical question regarding the discard of sperm that's stored with posthumous use. The discard of sperm stored with posthumous use. So the consenting period for storage is coming to an end, and whether we should consider contacting the partner who is still alive to let them know that we're going to be discarding the sperm. If we know that they know the sperm is stored, it feels very awkward discarding sperm with posthumous use, knowing that somebody out there could use it.
What would be the standard practice in your clinic?
We don't, because we feel that if they were going through grief, should we raise that grief again by letting them know the sperm's going to be discarded? Okay.
Does anybody else think that we should be contacting those patients and having discussions with them? Or do you think that this approach is the appropriate approach?
We contact.
So some contact.
And do you know that they know it's stored? Because you could be breaching confidentiality. If we know
their name is named on the use form, then we would contact them.
But that might not necessarily indicate that they know it's stored if they weren't present when the consent forms were completed.
That is certainly a dilemma.
Yeah.
Okay, I think we're going to move on. If there's any further questions, I'm sure you'll take later on.
Yes, of course.
Second on this evening, Rachel Gregory from Glasgow Royal Infirmary, talking to us about legal parenthood.
Okay, first of all, I'd like to again thank Ibo and his team for your hospitality, and also to Tony for asking me to present to you today. I've been asked to talk to you about legal parenthood. First of all, I apologise to any of you who are almost sick of hearing about legal parenthood over the last few years, but also to say that I'm seeing this from a scientific point of view, as a scientist, but also as the HFEA person responsible who's dealt with the aftermath of some of the problems we've had with legal parenthood consent, and dealt with the investigations, the audits, informing patients, and investigating how we can move forward with it. To give you a brief overview of what I want to talk to you about today, I want to just give a brief description of what legal parenthood actually is, and also give an example of a historical case where legal parenthood went to the High Court to discuss and declare whether the legal parenthood was actually valid or not. And this then had a huge impact on the clinics that consent patients for legal parenthood. I want to go on and talk about the difficulties that we face with gaining consent and how we can potentially prevent future error. I then want to sort of see if anybody else can offer us advice. I think we're at Glasgow Royal Infirmary. We've only gone through all of this legal parenthood dilemma just recently, and I think there's other clinics out there that are a lot further forward with it. So if you look on the HFEA website, you get this vague description of what legal parenthood actually means, and it's this lifelong connection between a parent and a child. And it affects things like nationality, inheritance, and financial responsibility to the child. If we try to look into this in a bit more detail, what we need to do is really consider legal parenthood different to parental responsibility. A person can be named as, can be given parental responsibility, essentially if their name is on the birth certificate for the child. And this parental responsibility means they're given the day-to-day, the ability to make day-to-day decisions such as religion, medical treatment, and education of the child. So who has parental responsibility? Well, essentially it is the couple if they are married, and the mother if the couple remain unmarried. And I'm going to go into this in a lot more detail later on when I explain the HFEA Act and the amended Act in 2008 and how this has changed. So, well, why is legal parenthood actually important, and why should we consider it different to parental responsibility? It affects citizenship and nationality. It affects the obligation to financially maintain the child by the legal parents, and also inheritance. And it also gives the legal parents rights to